Kim Kardashian reportedly paid $379,500 at auction for a vintage version of it. Tyler, the creator, recently acquired a major collection of it. Princess Diana wore it, Cary Grant showed it off, and Andy Warhol loved it. The Cartier Tank, folks, has been, since its creation, the supreme dress watch for connoisseurs and aesthetes of all hues, and a stable in the pantheon of very important objects as a symbol of luxury and refinement. And over the subsequent decades, the watch has grown to become an icon in the watch world. Why? Because there were so many things Cartier was getting right, so let's talk about their journey, shall we? The holy grail for any creative designer, regardless of field, is to make something that strikes such a fine balance between form and function and so eloquently communicates an aesthetic that it will not only last for many generations, but also always seem as modern as the day it was made. Some examples of such unique items include the Chaise LC4 by Le Corbusier, the Barcelona chair by Mies van der Rohe, and the Tank watch by Cartier. Aside from beginning one of the most popular and long-lasting watches ever made, Louis Cartier's simple and brilliant design has been open to modifications, updates, and experiments without ever losing its essence. Since its creation, men and women have adored this watch for the not-so-obvious reason that it works equally well for both sexes. And because we love the idea of nostalgia, the Cartier Tank is as popular today as it was in 1917, perhaps even more so. The success of the Cartier Tank is greatly due to the enduring appeal and the brand's tradition of making watches with unisex appeal and small faces. But how did this tradition start? How did the Cartier Tank become such an iconic piece? History has all the answers, folks, so let's go back to the beginning. The year 1917 was rather chaotic. It was 3 years into World War I, and while the Allies were in deep battle, Louis Cartier created what would become a symbol of 20th century luxe et chic. Cartier's rise to prominence pre-war was due in large part to the forward thinking of Louis-Joseph Cartier and the company's innovative approach to selling their watches. It was in 1904 that he created a wristwatch for his friend, the Brazilian pilot Alberto Santos Dumont, so that he could more readily read the time while in the air. Although it wasn't the first wristwatch ever made, it was a pivotal innovation since it made it abundantly evident that wristwatches, not pocket timepieces, were the wave of the future. Moving on, a radical aesthetic shift was also sparked by the Santos Dumont watch. Neither the Tonneau nor the Tortue watches that Louis Cartier created later in his career resembled the ornate flourishes of Art Nouveau, which the designer found intolerable. The prototype Tank, the model now known as Tank Normal, appeared in 1917, and its design was a major improvement over earlier tanks. Roman numerals on a clean, off-white dial softened the watch's aggressive lines. Brand cards stretched the case's square edges into a rectangle for the lugs. Then came the 1920s. You see, in the 1920s, the famous Jazz Age started playing out in an ultra-modern Art Deco context. So wristwatches were sometimes worn in addition to pocket watches, and they became the standard fashion accessory for men. And even though it seemed like magic when it happened, the Cartier Tank watch had become popular. There was Rudolph Valentino's swashbuckling exploits through the ancient Araby in The Son of Chic in 1926 that provided a moment of high camp incongruity for the Tank watch. The actor was so attached to his watch that he wore it throughout production despite the wardrobe department's best efforts to get him to remove it. In 1921, Cartier introduced the Tank Cintré, the first variant of the Normal, which stretched the square by rounding off its corners and curved the casing to better fit the contours of the wearer's wrist. Fred Astaire, who purchased one in 1928, exemplified the model's understated elegance. With its well-proportioned rectangular casing and softened angles, the Tank Louis Cartier introduced in 1922 had become the default Tank. Cartier also introduced the Tank Chinoise that year, with brancards resembling the lintels of a Chinese temple portico, as a fad for Far Eastern exotica swept over Europe. The story is getting much more enjoyable now, isn't it? Later in the decade, Duke Ellington was drawing huge crowds to the Cotton Club and putting Jay, the Great Gatsby, to shame with his impeccable style. His outfits were crafted for him by Anderson and Shepherd on Seville Road, and he accessorized with a Cartier Tank à guillemette, much like the similarly fashionable Maharaja of Patiala. Time was displayed in jumping hours and minutes through tiny windows in the brushed gold casing. It was indeed a watch to behold. Tank Allongé was introduced in 1922, followed by the Tank Savonnette and Petite Tank Rectangle, one of the few models geared particularly at women in 1926, and the square-faced Tank Obus towards the end of the decade. Some tank models were instant classics, while others faded into obscurity until, in some cases, being revived in the early 2000s by Collection Privée Cartier Paris, or CPCP. And don't be surprised by that fact. You already know that not all watches become successful. But one thing we have learned from Cartier, and that same thing was established by their 1920s record, is this: ideas that open doors to other ideas will become icons and objects to be valued. Do you understand? It is simple, really. One mother idea is 1,000 times more valuable than a dead-end design. Anyway, let's move on to the 1930s and 1940s. Remember that our goal right now is to understand why the Cartier Tank has become somewhat immortalized. So, the 1930s and 1940s. What do you remember those years for? The Great Depression, that's what. The Great Depression did not appear to have a chilling impact on Cartier's inventiveness. 3 new models were introduced at the beginning of the 1930s. The obscure Tank Formé Baguette, an elongated rectangle, the Tank Étanche with a lunette over the dial and a lockable crown, making it waterproof, and in case you're wondering, Étanche is French for impermeable, and the Tank 8 Jours was a double-barreled movement that provided an 8-day power reserve, which was an outstanding technical feat at the time. Due to its limited production and high value, about $100,000 according to Antiquorum, in 1996, the 8 Jours is widely sought after by collectors. Cartier, following in the footsteps of Jaeger-LeCoultre with their Reverso, released a tank model that was built to withstand the rigors of the tennis court or polo field as sporting activities grew increasingly fashionable. The Tank Basculante, released in 1932, included a case that could be turned along its length to cover the glass and reveal the metal rear. Then, the briefly popular Tank Monopoussoir, a stylish square-faced chronograph, appeared on the market. It was creativity and production going round and round. So the Tank Asymmetrique, released in 1936, was both a daring exercise in aesthetics and an exercise in usefulness. The case and hour markers were rotated by 45 degrees to better accommodate the position of a driver's hands while steering. This was repeated in the Tank Oblique, released in 1963. But in 1942, Louis Cartier died, and the heat from World War II was pretty bad. With Louis's death, this iteration of the tank was to be the last of its kind for decades. Despite Louis's death, Cartier was not ready to throw in the towel or stop their creativity train. They made a few modest changes and released the Tank Carré and the Arrondi, and they continued to pull in fans. This part of history was really fascinating to study. Interestingly, Clark Gable and Gary Cooper helped keep the tank in the hands of the Hollywood elite by purchasing identical models for themselves and the Duchess of Windsor. Now, despite the sweeping social and fashion shifts that occurred between the 1950s and the 1970s, the tank was consistently worn by influential people of all stripes. Despite their obvious differences, the identical watch looked great on Muhammad Ali, Pierre Balmain, Warren Beatty, Ingrid Bergman, and Stuart Granger. Tank, to most people, signified the iconic Louis Cartier tank, even though just a few new styles were introduced during this time, like the broad rectangle in 1952, the JJC for Jean-Jacques Cartier elongated in 1966, and the mini tank Allongé for ladies in 1962. The watch became even more of a cultural icon during this time. Then there was Andy Warhol, who bought the tank watch and never wound it. When asked why, he said, "Because it is the watch to wear." What a statement. As we all know, the Cartier Tank continues to outlive its 15 minutes of fame. Now let's fast forward to the 2000s. The Tank Louis Cartier, which has been in the Cartier catalogue from 1922 with a modest upgrade in 1944 until 1998, was brought back to life in 2012, while the Tank Follet was introduced at the same time. 4 rectangular wristwatches, the new Tank Louis Cartier XL Slimline, powered by Cartier's hand-wound in-house movement 430 MC and measuring just 5.1 millimeters thick, was a victorious return of the design that had established a point of reference for 9 decades. But in the meantime, watch fans had to turn to Cartier Paris to satisfy their craving for technical finesse. Cartier Paris Collection Privé has been reissuing vintage Tank and other case designs with mechanical movements from brands including Piaget, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Gerald Genta, Techniques Horlogères Appliquées, and Frédéric Piguet in extremely small quantities since 1998. The reassembled high-quality movements were given sapphire casebacks so that Cartier's trademark Côte de Genève and Double C Cartier logo finishing could be admired. These days, you may expect to pay a premium for any CP product. Popular designs include the Tank Monopoussoir, which features a brand new movement developed by François-Paul Journet, Denise Flageolet, and Vinay Halter. The Tank Vis-a-Vis, which is a modification of the Étrange with a 4-screw bezel, and the Tank Double Fuseau, which features an Arabic numeral and Chinese numeral dial. But after a slow start to the new millennium, Cartier finally figured out that making its movements was the way to the top of the horology industry. Thus, CP was succeeded by Cartier Fine Watchmaking, helmed by the incomparable Carole Fostier-Casapi. Tank Americaine Tourbillon Volant was caliber 9452 MC, the first Cartier movement to wear the Geneva seal, debuted in 2009. And since then, several Tank cases have housed a variety of haute horlogerie movements, including the exquisite Tank MC skeleton and the Tank LC Sapphire skeleton. So, do you see? The Cartier Tank is not only a cornerstone of the Maison's watch collection, but one of watchmaking as a whole. The design-focused model has evolved over the years to become a family of instantly recognizable clocks that are still Cartier's signature. At the same time, it has always been a barometer of cultural and horological developments, reflecting the spirit of the times in which it was made.